All right, everyone, we have someone very special on the show with us today. We don't interview a lot of men on the show, but when Mike came across our inbox, I had to say yes. It was a no brainer. Mike Evans, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So, Mike, you are best known as the founder of GrubHub, and there is an incredible story behind that. But as you know, on our show, our focus is asking top entrepreneurs like yourself the business questions you can't Google. So, for all of our listeners here, if you're curious to deep dive into Mike's full story, you can find it on the internet, I'm sure. But also, Mike has a book that is coming out soon where you'll get more of his backstory too. So, make sure you check out his book. We'll link it below for you in the show notes. However, Mike, I do want to ask you about your Cubicle to CEO story because you have such an impressive journey of building from your bedroom into a multi-billion dollar business that you then, went on to take public, which very, very few entrepreneurs do. And so tell us what was the catalyst, I guess, for you to jump into entrepreneurship?
So I literally the idea started in a cubicle. I was in my cubicle at Classified Ventures, which was an early internet mainstay. And there was a combination of things. On the one hand, I wanted to go and start a company. I'd always sort of seen myself as I wanted to start something. And I had a ton of school debt. I had like 260 grand in school debt, and it wasn't getting paid off quickly being a software developer. Like I was like, I need to do something different. But there was another piece to it too, which I think a lot of entrepreneurs can point to this and say like they felt this too, which was I really disliked having a boss. Like I think nobody loves having a boss, but like there was like a pathological, like I did not like being told what to do. And there was something about just being pigeonholed into I'm just a software developer. I couldn't go talk to the marketing people. I couldn't talk to the product people. I couldn't like see what our customers wanted. They just wanted me to do my dang job, which is honestly a reasonable expectation. But like I didn't want to just do my job. I wanted to do something more. And so that was the start. That was the like I gotta find something moment. So I started it. It was a hobby. I started it as a hobby. I would go home in the evenings and I would write software to create this delivery guide. The idea of the guide, it was several of my friends who were coworkers that we came up with the idea, but then the execution was I just had to go and like code it up. I had to go write the software and make the web pages and stuff like that. And so I did that. I did that in the evenings. And I was like, I was 25. You may remember at the time Buffy the Vampire Slayer was on. I was
Love
very
that show.
distracted by like TV and Xbox. And like I wanted to start my own thing, but I didn't have like the hunger for it really yet. And what happened was the website started to get some traction. It started to get visits from Google and from at the time MSN and City Search and these other like these websites that don't even exist anymore, and a little bit from this like new player Google. And so it started to get some traffic, and I was like, oh, I guess people find this useful. And what happened, the transition from a hobby to business, which I sort of define as when you make your first dollar, when it's no longer just a thing you do for free, was actually my business partner, the person who became my business partner, Matt. He sold the first restaurant he got $140 from Charming Walk Chinese restaurant in Chicago. And then it was like, I think it was like 6 days later, I had quit my job. I had taken what cash I had cashed in my 401k, and I was like, I'm going to do this thing. And so that was the big transition. The first few weeks were real nerve wracking because I had student loans that I had to pay off. I had to eat, right? I had rent I had to pay. Like it was really very scary. But that literal, it wasn't a metaphorical hunger, like a literal hunger drove me to learn how to do sales and how to sign up restaurants. It took 3 weeks before I signed up my first restaurant. And I was like, I've made a terrible mistake during that 3 weeks. And then it got a lot better. Once I finally sort of figured some things out, it got a lot better over the next few weeks.
I mean, you were truly a pioneer in this space so early to this concept of food delivery, whereas nowadays, it's very much a common thing to order off of Grubhub or many of the other platforms that offer this service. What I find really interesting about your story, your business model, and why I wanted to bring you on the show today is because you have basically been an advocate for transactional based business models instead of subscription based business models, which, like you mentioned yourself, is very counter trend to what a lot of companies are trying to move towards, which is that solid recurring, MRR, monthly recurring revenue, that membership based model. So I find this really interesting, and I want to get into this case study with you because, like you were able to see a 300% increase in revenue just from implementing this shift along with another user experience tweak in 1 week. And that's very impressive. So let's first talk about, set the scene for us at the time that you decided to change from subscription to transactional based revenue model. What year was it? How old was Grubhub at this point? Where were you guys as a company, whether that's user base, revenue mark, like set the scene for where you were starting.
Sure. So I quit my job and I finally figured out how to do sales. And what I was selling was, it's $100 a month for 6 months. $100 a month to be promoted to the top of our website. It was like kind of a vague, like it's a premium placement. And I had gotten, just through like hustle, I had gotten about 100 restaurants signed up over the course of a year, maybe clusters 70, 80 restaurants over the course of a year. And they were all paying $100 a month. Now they weren't actually paying $100 a month, because I'd be like, it's $100 a month, or if you just pay me for 6 months up front, you can have half off, because I needed the cash. Like I literally just needed to eat. And so I was selling many months of service for a discount. There was no pricing strategy behind it. I was just needed the money. And so this is where I got to the point where I got 70 restaurants, then 80 restaurants over the course of the year. I quit my job late 2003, I think. And then, so this is 2004. And what I was finding was, when I got up to about 80 restaurants, the number of restaurants that had canceling was starting to equal the number of restaurants I could sign up for a new month. And so to double my revenue, I'd have to go from 80 restaurants who were paying me to 160. I had to do all of the effort I had done so far over the course of a year. I had to do it all again while I still had attrition happening. I still had restaurants canceling. And I was like, God, this is a slog. And there was something that I hated about the subscription model. So I should point out, there was a technical thing I also implemented that enabled the switch to transaction. There were 2 technical changes. The first one was, I was like, well, I need to track how many orders these restaurants are getting so that I can prove to them that the subscription is valuable. And so I created a phone tracking system where I went and rented a bunch of phone numbers, and they came into the server I designed, and then the call would get forwarded out to the restaurant, and we would record it. We would tell both sides that they're being recorded. And then I could go to the restaurant and say, hey, look, you got 25 orders, or hey, look, you got 15 orders, or hey, look, you got 100 orders. Side note, that phone system is reviled to this day. At the time, it was great, but like, there are literally US senators that hate this phone system now. And so in my defense, it seemed like a good idea at the time. And the restaurants at the time, in the way it was used, they loved it, because all it really was a way to show how many orders you were getting. And there was something that really struck me that was wrong about the subscription model. And it was, if I sign up like restaurant A and they get 10 calls and they're being charged $100 a month, and I sign up restaurant B and they're getting 100 calls a month, they're both paying $100 a month, but one of them is arguably paying too much per order. It's like $10 per order. And the other one is arguably paying too little per order, $1 per order. And so the problem with the subscription method is that it's a one-size-fits-all method. Now, you might end up with like multiple sizes. You might end up with like a gold plan or a silver plan or whatever, but you're still just sort of only partially solving this problem of the value delivered is not equal to the value that's being charged for. And I ascribe very strongly to this idea of like, this comes from lean operations. If you create value for a customer, you charge them. And if you don't create value for a customer, you don't charge them. And that is like the rule of pricing and charging and value, that like, it's been true for 20 years, and it's fundamental to the way I think you should do business. And so there was a problem. I had this subscription model. It didn't fit all the customers equally. And so I switched it. I said, well, what if we charged on a per order basis for let's call it $3 an order. And I'll listen to the phone calls, and I'll deliver a CD, and I'll be like, look, there was 25 phone calls on here, 17 of them were orders. that's $51. And what I had done, and this is the reason why companies don't like this today, is I had shifted the risk of the product from the restaurant to myself.
Mm.
If you get a lot of orders, I get a lot of money. If you don't get a lot of orders, I don't get a lot of money. And for me, it was like a put me in coach moment. It was like, I want to be on that free throw line taking the shot. Like I want to be the one responsible for getting the orders done because I think I can do it. And so that was the transition right there. It took about a year to move from the phone orders to online orders, but the financial model underneath it was the same. And the dual unlock of being able to sign up restaurants more easily because I was taking the risk and removing the friction for the customer. That's what tripled the revenue at the company.
It's really interesting hearing, how you thought through this problem, especially because technology has advanced so much in the last, obviously, 15, 20 years. So the exact mechanics, like you said, might look different for a business now trying to adopt this model. However, the concept behind it, like you said, charging based on the actual value you're creating, not just, perceived value. And also the fact that you were so focused on reducing friction, reducing attrition, which I think a lot of entrepreneurs don't think through enough. They're so focused on trying to acquire new customers that they don't realize they're pouring water into a leaky bathtub, right? So it
Yeah.
takes just as
Yeah.
much work just to stay afloat. So that's really interesting
You know
that
where
you
I learned that concept?
where.
There's a restaurant called JB Alberto's here in Chicago, and I kept trying to sell them on GrubHub, and they just wouldn't sign up. But the owner, Tony, really like took some time to talk through their customer acquisition strategy. And what it came down to was we've been around for 20 something years, so we don't need new customers. We need a trickle of new customers, but
Mm.
most of our business is repeat purchase. And they were a very profitable pizza shop because they only had to spend for 1 out of every 100 customers. It is a mind-blowingly good idea to get repeat customers to pay. I talk about the distinction between a hobby and a business is you have a customer who pays you. But the distinction between a business and a good business is you have the same customer pay you a second time for the exact same product. If you can do that, then you've created a product that's good enough to really launch you into success.
Absolutely. And just for a little bit of clarity or context for users who may not have used Grubhub before or are, less familiar with this type of business model, when you switched from charging restaurants, let's say $100 per month to be listed on Grubhub, and you switched the transactional model, was the customer paying any piece into it? Like, for example, these days, when you order food through an app, typically as a customer, you're also paying a service charge to the
Yeah.
platform that you're ordering through. At the time that you were doing this, was all of the onus, so to speak, in terms of the transactional revenue or your cut of the pie, was that completely from the restaurant side, or did you also charge users to utilize your service?
Not only did we not charge users to use the service, we had an auditing system that made sure that the restaurants weren't charging our customers more than if you went to the restaurant directly.
Oh,
It
I
it
like
was a
that.
guarantee that you would not pay more if you came through us than if you went through the restaurant. Like we couldn't force restaurants to change their prices. We just canceled them. We just would not put them on the platform if they didn't agree to that because we didn't want to be the high cost provider. We were providing convenience. And for that, we were driving massive volume to the restaurants. It was at a slightly lower margin, but
Mhm.
they were very satisfied by it because at the time, those rates were to the restaurants were anywhere between 6% on the low end to like as high as maybe like 15%. And the difference was that the restaurants paid more to be higher in the rankings. And so
Mm,
though at those rates, those restaurants could still be profitable. That's very different from the current world with Grubhub and DoorDash and Uber Eats, where
yeah.
they're charging out the nose. They charge everybody like ridiculous amount.
Everybody loses in
And
that
let
scenario, yeah.
let me give you this is a little bit armchair quarterbacking because I haven't been there for 8 years, but I can talk a little bit about why that's necessary now and it wasn't then.
Mm,
And the reason is those companies don't have repeat users. So what happens is they have to spend so much money on new user acquisition and there's so little differentiation between them that it's very hard to get customers to stick around and be really high frequency loyal users without some sort of they have to go through a lot of effort to make that happen. And so they have to compete for new users, which means that they're charging the restaurants anywhere from 15% up to, I've heard the number as high as 40%. I haven't actually seen their numbers, but like very high rates to the restaurant, and then also charging the customer, right? And all of that money is just going to Google. It's not even profit. They just shovel it all to the advertisers. And it sort of blows my mind, because we had built this like business that had this really high repeat purchase rate. And that also, I mean, is why we had the luxury of going from a subscription model to a transaction model, is because our customers were very loyal and very frequent. And so I wanted them to come back and do a per transaction basis. I didn't have to somehow lock them into a contract. I'm talking about the actual diners now. I didn't have to lock anybody into a contract, because people came back because it was valuable in a differentiated way.
What do you think has changed over the last number of years with the addition of competitors in the marketplace? Like you mentioned, DoorDash, Uber Eats, GrubHub, obviously having evolved since when you first founded it. In your eyes, why are diners not coming back and using the same platforms over and over again?
The fulfillment is done by gig economy workers who then work for all three different platforms. And therefore, it's impossible to differentiate. In some sense, it seems cheaper, but it's very, very expensive to let your business slip into non-differentiation, because then the only thing you can do is compete on advertising dollars. And if all three companies have billions of dollars to spend and have billions of dollars to charge customers, that's an arms race, and it's a terrible way to run a business. And so I think that's the key, is that one of them will have to figure out how to do the delivery with a non-gig economy approach that is differentiated. I think that will be the company that ends up winning.
Interesting. All right, hot take, guys. Mike said it here, so we'll come
I've
back
said
in a
this
couple
publicly a bunch
years.
of times. Yeah, it's fine. I'm not sure that the current leadership of GrubHub loves me talking about this way. That's fine. I just hope they change. So it's fine by me.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's valuable. It's valuable input. And, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out over the next number of years, especially as someone who uses, these types of services. But back to your case study of implementing this change. So you allowed diners to start ordering through a website rather than through phone. So you reduced friction there. And then you allowed more restaurants to come on board because they weren't locked into these monthly rates and rather were paying per transaction. And you saw a 300% increase in revenue over a single week. So when that happened, was that truly just because you made an announcement to restaurants saying, hey, we're open for business now without you having to be a subscriber? Or did you actually invest in some sort of marketing campaign to aggressively acquire customers for that specific change?
It happened in a week, but it was like an overnight success, 2 years in the making, right? Because what had
Right.
happened is when we switched from, it was two steps in the process. The first was moving to the transaction model, and the second was when we moved away from the phone system to online ordering. And because the switch to transactional took the risk off the restaurants, right? Like, we don't make a dime unless you make a dollar, was the thing that I would say during the sales meetings, right?
Well, that's a good
As
one.
opposed to before, I would say, well, I need you to commit to $100 a month and just trust me, it works, right? The transactional model is much, much easier to sell, right? Because the risk is, there's no risk. Like, just sign up. If you get no orders, you pay nothing, right? And you tell me, and we even moved from a dollar-based fee to a percentage-based fee, all in that year leading up to online ordering. And so we went from I had to grind to get 80 restaurants, right, to like, it was a much larger number, like 200. But the number of consumers and the amount of orders that we were placing was still, let's say it's X, right? Like, it had grown from X to 2X over the course of that year. But then what happened when we moved to online ordering was the number that jumped was conversion rate. Conversion rate is just a measure of the number of people who are coming to your website, how many of them transact, how many of them convert into customers. And I'm sure probably almost everybody on this podcast knows that. I'm not trying to
No, it's
overly
super
explain it.
helpful.
Yeah.
I love when people take the time to define terms, because we have a whole gamut of listeners, from day one entrepreneurs to, very seasoned entrepreneurs. So I love it. Continue.
So think about where all of those eyeballs looking at the website are coming from. They're coming from Google mostly. They're coming from MSN. They're coming from digital sources. I'm not like, there people come to they come from a website to a website, and then they scroll down, and then there's a phone number that you have to call to place an order. And so when that phone number went away, and instead it was a button you had to push, we already had the people coming to the website. But this is a thing, this is a really important message. When customers are using a channel, and this is usually helpful in customer service, if somebody contacts you via email, don't respond with a text. If they call you, don't email them, right?
Mhm.
Whatever channel people choose to engage with your company is in, stay in that channel. Don't move them to a different one. And so people were coming to us on the web and we were forcing them to go onto the phone. I just didn't know that that was a thing you shouldn't do at the time. So that's a freebie like that. It took me like a lot of time and effort to learn this. And so what happened is when we moved to the online ordering, it was just, there was already people were already in that channel. Like, oh yeah, bloop, bloop, bloop. They click the buttons and then, and they'd enter their credit card and then they place the order. And at the time it was still early enough that the idea of putting a credit card in a website made people uncomfortable, which is nuts, right?
Right.
And so, but it was still more comfortable than reading it over a phone to a 17-year-old at a pizza shop, right? Who's going to like
True.
write it down somewhere and just like pin it
Leave
to the
it.
wall.
Yeah.
Who knows what they're doing, right?
Right.
So that taking that friction out was really about just giving customers what they already wanted.
Mm.
I love these.
They're
Just
so much
fun.
fun. Yeah. It's funny.
Campaigns.
You're the first guest who's ever been like, I love lightning round. Everyone else has anxiety around lightning round. So I'm here for it. I love it. Okay. Well, Mike, let's jump right on in. Question number one. What is the first thing you do when you get up in the morning?
I think about what it is that I need to accomplish, like from a goal perspective over like the next year. And I think about
Interesting.
what do I have to do today to move towards that goal. And so I try to have a very unstructured schedule and on a day by day basis, think about what activities move that ball forward. And I've done that every day for the last 20 years. What am I doing today? How does it ladder up to the total goal?
I love that. That's such a macro visionary perspective instead of being driven by urgency and what's on your to-do list today. So
I
that's
literally
smart.
got the concept from Stephen Covey's book, Seven Habits of
Oh,
Highly Effective People, where he talks about importance versus urgency. It's a
right.
great book. Again, another great book, in addition to Hangry, which I just wrote.
I love it. All the book recommendations. We have 3 now to read. So just from this episode. All right. Second question. What is one thing about you that surprises most people?
I don't consider either the IPO or the acquisition of wealth as success. I think that success needs to be personally defined. And at the time that I was at GrubHub, my goal was to help independent restaurants be more likely to succeed. And I was a success because I achieved that goal, not because it looked like what other people thought success was.
I love that answer. All right. Final question. I couldn't resist because you founded GrubHub. What is one restaurant you could order from every day without ever getting tired of
JB Alberto's pizza. It's magical with like the spicy peppers on the pizza. I might not get tired of it, but I might need to run more if I did that every day.
it? Is that the shop in Chicago that you mentioned
Yeah, it's the
earlier?
shop near me where the owner, like way back when, like kind of took
Yeah.
me under his wing and helped with some of my business education.
That's incredible. Well, we all know where to go now when we visit Chicago. So
Yeah, it's the place. It's the place.
thanks, Mike. You crushed it. I love your takeaway there of channel congruency, making sure that it's a seamless experience from initial contact through resolution or delivery, whatever it is, for the customer. I think we can all apply that, even in a primarily online business. Anyways, there's ways to reduce friction for the end user. I'm curious on the restaurant side, though, how did you get the word out about this new business model change to really spike the number of restaurants who are signing on quickly? Was it an
Yeah.
organic word of mouth, or did you have an intentional strategy behind that?
So I went home one evening and I called a bunch of restaurants. That's really what I did. So they were already, think about what in their eyes, they're already paying for transactional orders that are coming over the phone.
Hmm.
So what I did is I called and said, "Hey, do you have a fax machine?" And they all said yes. Every restaurant had a fax machine. I said, "Great. Instead of a few orders coming over the phone tonight, they're going to come over the fax machine. It's the same price as before, but you won't have to answer the phone. You just have to pick it up off the fax machine and then deliver the food." I didn't sell the restaurants on it. I just told them, "Oh, by the way, you're going to get a fax tonight." And then
Mm.
it was a presumptive sale. That's called presumptive selling, right? Like, but they were already sold and I was already providing value and they already trusted me. And so the transition from phone to fax machine was an operationally beneficial one for them anyway. And so then the restaurants that said yes, I think that first night it was like 12 restaurants. It took me like 2 hours to call them all. I just sorted them to the top of the page, right? So like I was like, okay, got online ordering. I'm just going to funnel all the orders right through them. And then it took me a few days to get like 80% of the restaurants adopted over. At the time, this was before PCI compliance in the credit card industry, and at the time, we went from just people saying the credit cards to like the credit cards for that first year were like over fax before PCI compliance forced us to like charge the credit cards and then pay the restaurants. That was a much harder transition, but it was a same apples to apples transition in terms of how they process the order.
Right. For your existing customers, I think that's so smart, by the way, that you just rolled it out with the first group who was ready to jump on board, moving them to the top of the page so they could really see the success in real time. How did you build your directory of restaurants who came on board who, like, for example, you mentioned that pizza shop that was
Yeah.
like, we're not going to sign up for GrubHub with the subscriber model, right? Because they said they already had all the customers they needed. How did you start to get new restaurants on board to utilize your service after you switched to transaction model?
After this switch, we were making enough revenue that I could employ another 2 or 3 people. So the first people I hired were salespeople to go then sign up restaurants. Well, that's not true. The first person I hired was a graphic designer to help the website. But the second person I hired, Todd, he was a salesperson. And so I hired the next hires 3, 4, and 5 were all salespeople, and their whole job was to sign up restaurants to get more orders.
That is smart. I think that it's interesting because I think most people jump to hiring sales and marketing first, and then they focus on user experience second. I find it really fascinating that you kind of went all in on improving user experience on both sides and then hired customer acquisition people, after the fact.
So I did both. So if you think about the first year of the business when it was transactional, and then even before we made this big switch to online ordering and transactional plus online ordering, right, which was the combination of the two was the unlock. You can't sell restaurants 8 hours a day. You can only really talk to them between 2:30 and 5, right?
Right.
Because you don't go in during the lunch rush or you get yelled at. You don't go in the dinner rush because you get yelled at. And they're not there before the lunch rush, like because they
Right.
have to sleep sometime. So there's really only like a 2.5 hour window that I could sell restaurants. And so there was an iterative process of I would go in and sell because I needed to make money. But then they would be like, I'd sign up, but gosh, I wish you had coupons. And so then like that next week, I would develop the product for coupons. And keep in mind, in this case, I'm the product person and the salesperson and the software developer. Like I'm all of the things
You're
at this
everything. Yeah.
point, right? Which is a typical experience for an entrepreneur, right? Most entrepreneurs don't get investment capital and then like go hire a bunch of people. Most businesses in the United States start, and probably worldwide, start with somebody just starts. Like there's no investment; they just start, and you do everything until you can get to the point where you actually are making enough money that you can hire somebody else to take some of those roles on. And so the sales process led into the product process, which led into the sale. It was a virtuous cycle. And the best book that I've seen that describes this concept is called the Lean Startup by Eric Ries, and he
Mm.
talks about this idea of like build the smallest viable product you can and then iterate on it constantly. And so the product, like it's yes and no. Like yes, I focused on product first, but it was informed by the fact that like it was brutally hard for me to go do sales, right? Like so the two were in sync with each other.
That makes sense. And I think you're actually the second person in a short time frame to recommend that book. So I think I'll take that as a sign to order it after this
Yeah, it's my
conversation
second
today.
favorite book right now, just behind Hangry, which I wrote. So
You got to
uh,
be
yeah.
your own, yeah, hype person for
Speaking
your
of
book.
sales, I developed the product already. I wrote the book, and I do describe this experience in the book as well. Yeah,
Amazing. Well, I am personally excited to read Hangry, and I love that you titled it that because how fitting. I would think we can all relate to that feeling of needing food instantly. I want to ask about this concept of returning customers because I think that's something you've really nailed and understand very well. It's interesting because with a traditional subscription model, right? It's kind of, I don't want to say you're forcing a customer to come back, because if you even look at a giant like, Netflix or Hulu, of course, customers can quit and cancel their account at any time. So it's not necessarily like they're obligated to stay, but it does kind of just build it in as a habit that some people don't even think about. So when you switch to a transactional model and people have to intentionally choose you every time they go through your service, what are some things you learned that other entrepreneurs listening to this could implement in how to get customers to come back when they're in a way not, forced to come back? How do you get them to come back? And I realize that the context of this case study happened, more than a decade ago. So some of the, technological advances have made things like, these days, if someone were to, allow online ordering, it's like, well, that's kind of just like the starting base, right? Like
Yeah.
everybody offers that. So if there's anything that isn't dependent necessarily on it being a window of opportunity during the time that you implemented it, but is still evergreen and could work for a business today, does anything come to mind there?
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts on this that are totally independent of the time or the technology. The first is the concept of default behavior versus proactive behavior. And so when you have a subscription model, the default behavior is that you are paying every month, and the proactive activity you have to take is you have to cancel. And we did something similar with restaurants to reduce attrition. This is going to sound like a really weird feature, but we paid restaurants once a week, right? That's just it was a good balance between making sure they got their money on time and the amount of processing time it took for us to go through credit cards, and then the cost of just doing the ACH transfers. But we put a button on their page. So when you went to your page to manage your account, there was a button that just said pay me now. And so they had the option to get paid every day, but the default behavior was to get paid every week. And so even though everyone would have preferred to be paid every day, it was only the ones that really cared about it that hit it. And it was something like less than 2% of customers hit that button regularly, right? So the idea that you want to be thoughtful about what's default behavior and what takes somebody proactive effort to go do matters. And then if it is proactive effort, you have to think about the difference between a vitamin and a painkiller. A vitamin is a nice to have, right? You can, and I'm not the one who made up this analogy, but like you can skip it a few days and you're fine. But if you have a migraine, you got to take your painkiller, right? I had built a business where people were hungry, and I was the solution to that. That is a necessary thing. Like people came back to us because if they didn't, they had to cook or not eat. And
Right.
when you're tired, cooking can sometimes you end up just eating Doritos sometimes, right? A lot of people have been in this experience. And so part of what enabled frequency without it being default behavior was that the need for the product itself was so high. Now, would that work as well if I started it right now? Because yes, the need's still there, but you have multiple options, right?
Right.
So maybe that in and of itself is a little bit challenging, which is of course why GrubHub released GrubHub Plus to make it a subscription model. It went back to a subscription model, but with customers, because when the need exists, you want them to default back to your brand, right?
Right.
And so I think those are things that you have to think through, this default behavior, and then the painkiller versus vitamin. Those go into the decision about how you design the product.
Right. That is super helpful. And you put into much better terms what I was trying to express of, not a customer necessarily being forced to do something, but like you said, defaulting to doing something because it's the automatic behavior versus thinking about the proactive behaviors.
And so leading into what you said earlier about the stuff that you can't Google, I'll go a
Yeah,
step further and
please.
I'll talk about that button that you could hit to pay yourself. We called it the morphine drip. And the reason we called it that was if you're like in a long-term care facility and you have a button that you can push to get morphine, you feel better even if you've hit your limit and it's not actually releasing any morphine. So those buttons stop working after a period of time, but people still use them because just the ability to have control and be proactive makes people feel better about, well, in that case, it's a very important sort of thing I don't want to really be flippant about. But for just being able to go hit the button, it put the control in the customer's hands about when they got paid. So it removed the objection about like, I really wish you guys didn't just hold on to my money so long, right? Like,
Mm,
just go hit the button. Even though we knew that they wouldn't do it regularly, the not even just the
option.
illusion, the option of control was really, really powerful. And so that's another thing that comes into this sort of default behavior versus proactive behavior is you want to lean into the value of the perception of control.
This is massively helpful. My gears are already starting to turn in my own brain about how can we reduce friction for our customers? How can we add in those options that make them, like you said, feel more autonomous in their experience with your brand? Um, and then how do you increase, just frequency of use and really thinking about that and focusing on that and attrition versus always new customer acquisition? Before we wrap up with the final question, I did want to give listeners a little glimpse into what you're working on these days, which is fixer.com. And I think it's such an interesting business. So if you want to give, just a quick bit of context on what that business is, and is there anything related to what we've talked about today that you are taking into, this new business with you?
Yeah, it's very relevant relative to the conversation. So the name of the business is fixer.com, and it's an on-demand handyperson service where the people who do the work are full-time W-2 employees that we train from scratch. The whole thesis behind the business is that there aren't enough skilled workers in the United States to satisfy the demand, and that there's a social problem related to it's very hard to get the training, the entry path. It's very gender exclusive, and it's hard to access. If you don't have an uncle or a dad, it's hard to get into the trades, but it's a highly lucrative, economically mobile career path. And so we're both creating an entry path into the trades that's gender inclusive, and it enables us to create this amazing experience in customer homes. And so that's the business. It's doing really well. Like, people really like this idea that like you can go online, you can pick a time, we show up when we say we're going to show up, and we do the work, and we have a whole team approach so we can escalate if we have ever more complex things to do in a home. And so it works really well. It's like being able to use a remote control for your home in a way that you can do for pizza, which I made 20 years ago, right? And
Yeah.
so, but just getting into the relevance of the subscription versus transaction model, it's a transactional model, and we've rolled out a subscription model. And so I've gone the other direction. And the reason that we've gone the other direction is because the subscription model, where we come every month, we don't just do the list of things that are broken. We take care of proactive maintenance in the home. So we do things like
Mm,
change the filters in the HVAC system, or change your light bulbs, or put in batteries in your fire detectors. Or we do things like we inspect the windows when it's getting cold or when it's getting really hot. And we do that like in August. And then we do things like make sure that like all of the drains and plumbing in the house are working on 1 month. And we check all the grout and caulking on the tub on other months. And so what we're doing with the subscription model is not trying to take advantage of default behavior versus proactive behavior, which I said before, but it's actually a value add in that it removes the mental load of owning a home. If you don't have to worry about it because you know somebody's coming, it removes anxiety and removes the mental load. And so it's more about that emotional benefit than it is about the fact that we're just trying to get 12 transactions a year.
right.
And so it's funny that like it's come full circle. I'm back to subscription, but it's because it creates more value, not because it's an unlock for this default versus proactive behavior. It does do that though. Like, it is really nice to know that we don't have a seasonality dip in February for
Mm.
a la carte or ad hoc transactions, because we have a subscription base and we know that we're still going to go do the jobs in February for our customers. And so that's the new model. I'm using what I learned at GrubHub to create a more socially impactful, but still huge business in this case.
Right. And well, I think the beautiful thing, and thank you for illustrating the differences and the nuances between why a subscription model might make sense for this business versus, where you went with Grubhub originally. I think it also is worth noting, I suppose, that with most subscription businesses, the onus is on the user to take advantage, like gym memberships, Netflix, you know,
Mm,
delivery services, you as the user have to frequently use a service enough to create the value and to extract the value that you're paying into it. Whereas what you're saying with, Fixer is that if if a handy person is scheduled to come into your home on a regular basis to take care of things and, both fix things and be proactive about potential things coming down the pipeline, they are receiving that value guaranteed every single month, and it's not on them to be like, oh, I better utilize my monthly rate to get someone
right.
to, I don't know, fix the water heater or something to make it worth their while. So I really like that mindset, and I hope that for the listeners, you can apply from this conversation today, thinking about where is the value actually created in your product and what kind of revenue model actually best services the client to attract repeat business from the same clients. And that can determine whether or not transactional versus subscription model may be your best fit. So, Mike, thank you so much for your wisdom and your insight today. My final question to you that I ask all of our guests is, what does being a CEO mean to you?
I have 3 jobs as a CEO. I 3 things that I have to accomplish. I have to make sure that the goal of the company and the vision of the company and what everybody is trying to accomplish is clear, and how everyone's work relates to that. That's job number 1. Job number 2 is I need to make sure that the right people are working towards that goal. And number 3 is I need to make sure that everyone has the resources to get that done, and the obstacles that are in their way get removed. That's it. That's all I do. And that's really busy time at times, like when I'm raising financing, for example, getting those resources is hard, or when I'm doing hiring. But at other times, it's mostly staying out of people's way. If you know the vision and you have the resources and you're the right person, like, have a good time. Let me know if you need me. I'm not going to micromanage. It's too much damn work. And so that's what being a CEO is for me. Is just really setting up the team that I work with for success.
Super smart. Thanks, Mike.